The billionaire sat in the corner booth of the luxury restaurant, his tailored suit glinting slightly under the golden light. His laughter was loud, almost echoing, as he scrolled through his phone and watched the markets rise. Around him, people whispered his name, some with admiration, some with envy, but none dared approach. Power had its own gravity, and he was well aware of the pull he commanded. When the waitress walked up to his table, her uniform slightly faded and her shoes clearly worn from long hours, he didn't even look up. He was bored, surrounded by wealth, yet craving something to mock, something to make him feel alive in his superiority. As she poured his wine, he glanced up and saw her, a young black woman, maybe in her late 20s, with eyes that seemed to carry the quiet weight of endurance. A smirk tugged at his lips as an idea crossed his mind. "Tell me," he said, leaning back in his chair with exaggerated ease, "what would you do if you had $1 billion? His tone was mocking, his words soaked in arrogance. The nearby table heard it, and a few people chuckled under their breath. It was meant to be a joke, another display of class power disguised as casual banter. The waitress didn't flinch. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, and set the bottle down gently. "First," she said quietly, "I'd make sure every worker in my restaurant could afford a night off without worrying about bills." Her voice wasn't angry, but calm, as if she had thought about this before. The billionaire raised an eyebrow, surprised that she answered at all, let alone so directly. She continued, her words deliberate, her tone steady. "Because when you've spent your life serving people who never see you, you learn that money doesn't make people better. It just makes them louder." Her response unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He tried to laugh it off, swirling his glass of wine. "So you'd give it all away?" "That's bad business," he said, trying to reclaim control of the conversation. But the waitress just smiled faintly. "No," she said, "that's good humanity. Business is what got most people struggling in the first place." There was something about the way she said it, simple, unembellished, that felt sharper than any insult. Around them, the restaurant buzzed on. But for a moment, the billionaire couldn't hear anything except her voice. She took a step back but continued, perhaps sensing that she had struck a nerve. "People think those without money don't understand finance," she said. "But when you live on the edge every day, you learn more about value than numbers could ever teach. You learn to stretch, to plan, to sacrifice. You learn what a dollar costs, not in price but in peace." He stared at her, caught between disbelief and discomfort. Nobody talked to him like this. He was used to deference, to fear disguised as respect. But this woman wasn't afraid. She spoke like someone who had already lost everything that could be taken from her. The billionaire forced a laugh, but it came out weaker this time. "You talk like you've been in business yourself," he said. She nodded slightly. "In a way, I have," she replied. "Every shift is a business decision. Every hour I stay to cover someone else's table means my child has a meal and my rent stays paid. You call it business when you trade stocks. I call it survival when I trade sleep for security." Her words pierced through the layers of his comfort, dismantling the illusion that his wealth was proof of superior intelligence. For the first time that evening, he didn't have a clever retort. He studied her more closely now, noticing the tired lines around her eyes, the small scar on her wrist, the calm defiance in her posture. He wanted to dismiss her words as sentimental nonsense, but something in him recognized the truth. Money had insulated him from pain, but it had also blinded him to meaning. He spent his life chasing numbers that never filled the void. She, on the other hand, carried dignity in her exhaustion. It was a kind of wealth he had never known. He leaned forward, his curiosity overcoming his pride. "What would you do first?" he asked again, this time without sarcasm. She took a breath. "I'd build a place where people like me could rest," she said. "A place where no one has to smile through disrespect just to make rent. Because we've learned to endure everything except being seen." The simplicity of her dream disarmed him. He had always measured ambition in billions, not in peace. But here was someone who defined success by humanity, not excess. He remembered suddenly his own beginnings, how his mother used to work 2 jobs, how he had once promised to give back if he ever made it. That promise had long been buried under layers of profit margins and board meetings. The waitress's words felt like a mirror held to his forgotten self. "You ever think about investing?" he asked, half trying to shift the topic, half genuinely curious. She smiled faintly. "Every day," she said. "I invest in people. My little sister's education, my neighbor's groceries when she can't afford them. The return isn't in dollars, but it's real." Her words lingered long after she walked away. For the rest of the evening, he found himself distracted, her calm confidence echoing in his head. When the check came, he left a tip so large it startled her, but when she caught up to him outside to thank him, he waved it off. "You already gave me something worth more," he said quietly. He walked away before she could respond, unsure why his chest felt so heavy. That night, in his penthouse overlooking the city, the billionaire couldn't sleep. The lights of the skyline seemed hollow now, the silence too loud. He replayed her words again and again, realizing they weren't about money at all. They were about value, purpose, and the difference between wealth and worth. He had built an empire on numbers, but this woman had built wisdom out of necessity. In her quiet resilience, she had more power than any billionaire could buy. The next morning, he called his foundation and ordered a new initiative, one focused not on branding or tax breaks, but on real support for service workers. It wasn't charity. It was accountability. For once, his wealth was listening to the truth spoken by someone the world had ignored. It started as a night meant for entertainment, a social outing with other elites who shared the same smug satisfaction of knowing they could buy whatever they wanted, including laughter at someone else's expense. The billionaire, whose name had become synonymous with luxury and dominance in business circles, leaned back in his seat as the evening unfolded. He was surrounded by polished marble, chandeliers that glittered like frozen raindrops, and people who existed only within the echo chamber of wealth. When the waitress came to their table, her presence stood out, not because she was different in beauty, but because she seemed grounded in a place reality rarely reached within these walls. She was black, dressed in the crisp yet faded uniform that marked her as invisible to most of the people dining there. Her movements were practiced and efficient, her politeness mechanical, but her eyes carried a quiet intelligence that didn't fit the script of the role she was forced to play. The billionaire's friend nudged him, whispering with a grin, "Ask her for financial advice. Let's see what she says." It was meant to be a joke, the kind of cruel amusement born from people too wealthy to remember humility. With a smirk, he turned to her and said, "You deal with a lot of money around here, right? Tell me, how would you invest $1 billion? The table erupted in laughter, the sound sharp and dismissive. But the waitress didn't laugh. She simply looked at him, the faintest flicker of something, amusement, maybe pity, crossing her face. Her silence stretched long enough for the laughter to die. Then she spoke. "I'd start," she said, her tone calm but heavy, "by investing in something that actually grows people, not just profits." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that silenced the entire table. The billionaire blinked, unsure how to respond. She continued, her eyes unwavering. "You all talk about returns, but you never talk about repair. What good is money if the world it buys keeps breaking?" The friends shifted uncomfortably, their smirks fading. The billionaire leaned forward, caught off guard by the sudden turn. "You think I'm breaking the world?" he asked, still trying to sound amused. The waitress didn't hesitate. "I think you're pretending not to notice it's already broken," she said softly. Her words hit harder than any insult. She spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had watched the system from the bottom, who had seen the cost of decisions made in boardrooms by men like him. "You joke about money," she said, "because it's the only thing you've ever trusted. But money doesn't teach you empathy, and without empathy, even the richest people live in poverty of the soul." The table was utterly silent now. One of the billionaire's friends tried to interrupt, muttering something about not taking it seriously, but the billionaire raised his hand to stop him. For the first time that night, he wasn't laughing. He found himself studying her face, wondering how someone who earned in a month what he spent on a bottle of wine could speak with such conviction. "You talk like you know me," he said, trying to regain control of the moment. The waitress tilted her head slightly. "I don't need to know you," she said. "I've seen enough people like you. You measure your worth in numbers, but you don't see that those numbers are built on people like me." Her voice wasn't bitter. It was calm, steady, painfully matter-of-fact. She spoke not as an accuser, but as a witness. "You talk about opportunity," she went on, "but opportunity looks different when you're standing behind a tray instead of a table." The billionaire felt something he hadn't felt in years: shame. Not the fleeting kind that comes from being embarrassed, but the deep kind that comes from realizing the truth about yourself. He wanted to argue, to remind her that he had worked hard for everything he had, but the words wouldn't come. Because somewhere inside he knew she was right. He had once been hungry, driven, idealistic. But success had mutated into arrogance, and wealth had insulated him from the pain that once made him human. Her words were stripping that insulation away, layer by uncomfortable layer. As she stepped back to refill their glasses, he found himself asking, "What would you do differently?" She paused, then said, "I'd stop treating wealth like a scoreboard. People chase billions and still feel empty because they've mistaken control for purpose. The best kind of investment isn't in what you own, it's in what you give that outlives you." It was a line that sounded rehearsed, but not in the way of performance, more in the way of survival. It was the kind of thought that comes from countless nights spent questioning the fairness of a world that rewards greed more than goodness. The billionaire stared down at his reflection in his glass. The sparkle of the wine looked duller now, as if her words had drained the shine out of everything around him. He couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to him without fear or flattery. It felt disorienting, but also strangely grounding. When she walked away to serve another table, the silence she left behind felt louder than the laughter had ever been. Later that evening, when the crowd had thinned and the noise had settled, he asked to speak with her again. She hesitated, unsure if it was another joke, but eventually returned. He asked her where she learned to think like that. She shrugged. "Life teaches you when you can't afford mistakes," she said. "You learn to read people, to see what they hide behind their success. I've watched so many of you, powerful, rich, miserable. You wear your pride like armor, but it's just fear underneath." Her gaze was steady, not cruel, just observant. "You laugh at people like me," she added, "because you think we remind you of failure. But what you don't realize is we remind you of what you've lost, your empathy, your hunger, your sense of enough." He wanted to respond, but there was nothing to say. Every argument that came to mind felt hollow. She wasn't attacking him, she was revealing him, holding up a mirror he couldn't look away from. When he left the restaurant that night, the city lights felt colder than usual. The reflection of his own face in the car window seemed unfamiliar, as if he were seeing himself for the first time, without the filters of wealth and status. In the days that followed, her words stayed with him. They echoed in board meetings, in conference calls, in moments when he caught himself dismissing people beneath him. The arrogance that once defined him began to feel like a burden. He started listening more, asking questions instead of assuming answers. Slowly, he began to understand what she meant about repair. The world didn't need more billionaires chasing expansion. It needed more people willing to restore what greed had broken. And in that quiet realization, he felt something shift, something that no fortune could ever buy. The night was supposed to be another reminder of his status. The billionaire had chosen one of the city's most expensive restaurants, a place where even the lighting seemed to bow to those who could afford to dine there. Every detail around him spoke of wealth: the crystal glasses, the imported art, the hushed voices of waiters trained to anticipate every demand before it was spoken. He thrived in such places because they reflected the world he believed he had mastered. Success to him was measured in silence bought by fear and admiration. But when the waitress approached, a young black woman with steady eyes and an air of quiet defiance, something in the script of his world began to falter. She wasn't intimidated by the tailored suits or the expensive watch on his wrist. She didn't look away the way others usually did when he stared too long, and that in itself intrigued him. He decided to amuse himself. "Tell me," he said, his tone laced with mock interest, "what's your secret to financial success?" His companions chuckled, their laughter dripping with condescension. It was a cruel little game, the powerful pretending to invite the powerless into their realm, only to laugh when the invitation was taken seriously. The waitress paused, meeting his gaze, and in that moment the air seemed to shift. "My secret?" she asked softly, setting down his drink. "Knowing what can't be bought." The table fell silent, the laughter dissolving as quickly as it had started. There was no hesitation in her voice, no sign of nervousness. It was the kind of answer that felt heavier than the words themselves. The billionaire tilted his head, forcing a smirk. "And what can't be bought?" he asked, expecting something sentimental he could dismiss. But the waitress didn't flinch. "Self-respect," she said. "Peace. The kind of sleep that comes from knowing you didn't step on someone else to stand taller." Her tone was calm, but it cut through him like a blade of truth. He tried to wave it off, pretending not to care, yet something in her eyes made him uneasy. She continued, her words deliberate and unshaken. "You think I don't understand money because I serve you, but I understand it better than you ever will. I know exactly what it costs to survive without it." He sat back, his mind unexpectedly quiet. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not his employees, not his competitors, not even his friends. He was used to control, to dictating the terms of every conversation. But this woman, with her worn shoes and tired hands, had just stripped him of that power without even raising her voice. "You've got a sharp tongue," he said, attempting to recover. She smiled faintly. "No," she replied. "I've just had to learn to speak the truth before someone else speaks over me." Her words weren't rehearsed. They were born from experience, from the necessity of being heard in a world designed to silence her. As she stepped away, the billionaire's reflection in the glass of his wine caught his attention. For the first time, he didn't like what he saw. The image of success that once filled him with pride now looked hollow, almost pitiful. Her words had cracked something open, something he had spent years building to protect himself from guilt. He thought about the people who cleaned his offices after hours, the drivers who opened his car doors, the staff whose names he never bothered to learn. They all existed in the background of his wealth, invisible until he needed them. The waitress had just reminded him that those invisible lives held more truth than his empire ever had. He called her back later, unable to let it go. "You seem to think people like me are the problem," he said, half defensive, half curious. She shook her head. "Not all of you," she said quietly. "Just the ones who forget that people matter more than numbers. The ones who think generosity is charity instead of justice." The simplicity of her statement stunned him. She wasn't asking for pity or admiration. She was asking for awareness. "You talk about changing the world," she continued, "but most of you just rearrange it so it stays comfortable for you. Change isn't about comfort. It's about conscience." Her words hit him harder than any business failure ever had. They weren't angry. They were painfully clear. She wasn't preaching. She was describing the world as she lived it. For her, every dollar represented a trade-off between need and dignity. For him, it represented another step in an endless climb toward nothingness. He realized that while he had spent his life trying to be remembered for his wealth, she was trying simply to be seen for her humanity. He asked her name before she walked away, something he never did with servers. "Danielle," she said. He repeated it quietly, committing it to memory. That night, as he left the restaurant, her words followed him like an echo. They haunted the back of his mind through every meeting and every deal in the weeks that followed. He began to notice things he had ignored before: the exhaustion in his employees' eyes, the performative gratitude of people who couldn't afford to displease him. He started questioning the version of success he had built his life around. Was it power, or was it fear disguised as achievement? He didn't transform overnight, but something fundamental shifted inside him. The next time he was at a restaurant, he looked the waiter in the eye, asked about his day, and listened. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the first honest thing he'd done in years. He started attending his foundation meetings in person, not to give speeches, but to hear the stories of the people his money was supposed to help. He realized that all his wealth had done was build walls between him and the world. Danielle's voice had shown him how to tear one down. Months later, he returned to that same restaurant. Danielle was still there, moving gracefully through the crowd. When she saw him, she looked surprised but not intimidated. He thanked her, not for the service but for the truth she had given him. She smiled, a quiet acknowledgement that didn't need words. The billionaire walked out that night with no entourage, no arrogance, just a strange calm he couldn't explain. He would never forget that moment when his ego met its match, not in another boardroom titan, but in a woman the world chose to overlook. Her first words had dismantled the empire he thought was unshakable, exposing the emptiness beneath it. And in that emptiness, he found the beginning of something real, something that couldn't be measured by wealth or power, but by the courage it took to listen,